my name is Nina Balmaceda. Warm greetings from the School of Divinity at Duke University in Durham, North Carolina. I am delighted to present my paper, The Manipulation of Religious Sentiment in Contexts of Party Linkage Decay in the Americas, at this Stott-Bediako consultation on Jesus and Empire, Christian Witness in the Context of Power at the University of Arad in Romania. This paper seeks to alert people of faith, especially pastors and other Christian leaders, about the threat of manipulation of religious discourse for partisan purposes that are against God's kingship. This is a descriptive but also a normative conceptualization based on empirical observation in the Americas. The paper is organized in 4 sections. The first is a brief historical introduction, and then I introduced a description of the current political context in the Americas, explaining the importance of political representation, the meaning of linkage, and the strategies that are more observable currently. Also, discussion about Christians as members of probably the persuadable middle in their respective societies, discussion of whether what we are observing corresponds more to persuasion or manipulation of religious sentiment for political gain, and a few preliminary conclusions. This paper seeks to contribute to a better understanding of the societal and political forces that interact with local churches and denominations in the Americas. The local church, as a social and cultural institution, is not apolitical. Even when some leaders of local congregations may think that politics is not important, people of faith are citizens, individually considered, and their collectives, that is, the congregations, are part of civil society. Faith communities, as part of civil society, are affected also by the context, and their context includes sociological, political, economic, and environmental factors. These are important and affect the life of the congregation. In the same vein, churches, as living collectives, are expected to play a role in the wider community. They play a political role, but hopefully not a partisan one. I refer to politics as the activities involved in getting and using power in public life and being able to influence decisions that affect a country or a society, following the Oxford Learner's Dictionary. So, Christian communities, at some level, are political institutions when they raise their voice, but also when they choose to remain silent. Whether local congregations or church denominations raise their voices in support or in opposition to social realities and public policies, for example, standing up for workers' rights, opposing workers' exploitation, or denouncing racism or remaining silent about racism, talking about poverty or standing up against violence, or remaining silent in silence when there is overspread violence, or on issues related to gender and sexuality, etc., or when they support the status quo by remaining silent. These are all expressions of the Christian communities playing a political role as part of their being part of civil society in their countries. So I am referring to being political as something different from being partisan. Recognizing this fact of social life is not the same as saying that churches are partisan or should be partisan entities. In fact, this paper's argument is that given the current socio-political context in most countries of the Americas and probably around the world, local congregations and church denominations must remain ever vigilant to partisan manipulation attempts. As citizens in the Americas, we must strive to understand the complex political, historical background of where we live, but also the immediate causes of the problems afflicting vulnerable groups. To do this, we must consider social science findings regarding the impacts of public policies in order to contribute and support the effective implementation of policies that promote equity in the access to opportunities. In the same vein, we must oppose those who seek to foster the concentration of power and deepen inequality, which contributes to further abuse of power and corruption. These are difficult and complex issues which should invite us to question the superficial answers that we often hear from the lips of political candidates and sadly many times also from church leaders. Facing these questions in the Americas in contexts such as the current ones of political polarization and widespread discontent with democracy due to the lack of effectiveness of the institution of political representation in many of our countries make this challenge even more difficult. Due to the global COVID pandemic, many social and economic problems have been exacerbated in our countries. Even in highly industrialized democracies, discontent with the democratic institutions is present, all the more in countries that are affected by multiple crises. Nevertheless, because it is a tough challenge, it does not mean we should not care. As believers, we are responsible for seeking not the numerical growth of a particular congregation or church denomination, but for bearing witness and embodying God's love for all of creation, embodying the message of just peace and reconciliation of Jesus of Nazareth, who lived in Palestine under the oppression of the Roman Empire. So let's talk very quickly about a historical background for this paper. The religious landscape in the Americas has been changing constantly since the 1960s, as increasing numbers of Latin Americans identify as Protestant or evangelical Christians. The religious experience is not something that only affects a person's spirit. It involves a set of questions and ideas about God, the self, the community we live in, the surroundings, and the rest of creation. Since the beginning of the Cold War, if not before, many evangelical leaders in Latin America have been consuming literature that are direct translations from white evangelical writers in the US. This has an impact in the way of thinking of many evangelical leaders and allows for an ideological use of faith. The Cold War was a period of geopolitical tension somewhere around between 1947 and 1991. And this process of competition for global dominance put the US and USSR as rivals. Even when there was no declared war between the two superpowers, nor actual fighting in the respective territories of these countries, the US and the USSR and the Soviet Union measured their forces through proxy wars in many countries around the world, including El Salvador and Nicaragua in the Americas. In the case of Latin America, the US influence most times was reflected in the direct or indirect support of military or civic military regimes that brutally repressed movements seeking more social justice and democratic governance. The end of the Cold War allowed for democratic transitions in most countries of the Americas, since only Colombia, Costa Rica, and Venezuela had remained with periodic, relatively free elections during that period of time. So the third wave of democratization that started in the late 1970s brought the return of competitive party politics to most of the Americas. Yet in the 1980s and 1990s, the hope for democratic transformation was rising, only to see those hopes for social and economic transformation being shattered due to the drastic imposition of neoliberal economic policies in the region. Unfortunately, in Latin America, even after the end of the Cold War, high numbers of evangelicals continued to support violent politicians and even anti-democratic leaders, such as Alberto Fujimori in Peru between 1990 and 2000, Álvaro Uribe in Colombia between 2002 and 2010, Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua since 2007, and Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil since 2019. Obviously, not every evangelical has supported these violent leaders, but too many of them do. Let's talk a little bit about the current political phenomena. 50 years after the end of the Cold War, political parties in the Americas are experiencing a process of deinstitutionalization. And in some countries like Bolivia, Ecuador, Peru, Honduras, among others, of actual decay. Experts have identified that the process of party deinstitutionalization is present even in countries like Chile, which was one of the few Latin American countries where the party system was actually considered institutionalized. So representation, which is an essential component of modern democratic politics, is suffering. Representation means to have a voice, to be able to influence political decisions. When political representation is effective, citizens are likely to accept the results reached through democratic electoral processes. In contemporary democratic systems, while civic organizations and social movements play a role in representation, the actual function of articulating broad political interests and implementing public policies correspond to political parties. So political parties are extremely important. Parties are expected to be the bridges between society and government institutions, giving systemic voice to the concerns of citizens as agents operating within the state concerns. In Latin America, political representation through parties tends to be very low in quality, weakening the trust in democratic institutions. Political parties are not necessarily evil institutions, even though we have to recognize that they are prone to corruption. When they operate within minimum standards of decency and honesty and transparency in the use of resources, they can contribute to the well-being of a nation. They are essential for democratic politics. In the same vein, pursuing a political career can be a dignified choice when individuals do it with honesty and integrity and with the necessary academic and practical preparation. Having qualified party candidates who can clarify and justify policy positions to the electorate contributes to increasing the quality of political representation and therefore the good functioning of modern democracy. Political parties use three major linkage types in their effort to secure elected office: through programmatic linkage, through clientelism, and through incorporation. And linkage is this connection between the political party and the population. Let's talk about programmatic linkage. That is based on policy responsiveness or shared ideological positions regarding widespread concerns in the country. This type of linkage provides indirect and conditional benefits available to party supporters as well as non-supporters. For example, good policies or bad policies. I mean, it could be either directed to controlling inflation or reducing unemployment or increasing access to healthcare or improving the quality of public education, etc., etc. So it's very general, right? On the other hand, clientelism offers direct, excludable benefits to individuals or relatively small groups of voters in exchange for their support. For example, offering free gasoline in exchange for placing the party banner in someone's vehicle, or distributing shoes or mattresses or food to specific communities collectives that identify with one's party. It is a patronage, especially, it's a form of clientelism in the intra-party flow of benefits to members. Another strategy is incorporation. It involves the integration of major political salient societal interests through group-targeted policies and benefits that reserve party nominations for representatives of such groups and or identity-based appeals to specific sectors of the population. And this is the one I want to focus on for the rest of the presentation. Meaningful programmatic competition happens when political parties embrace clearly differentiated policy positions. However, when parties are unable to offer meaningful programmatic alternatives to deal with relevant issues, many of their members will apply to other strategies. In context of exacerbated social, economic, and political crises like those currently affecting most of the world, effective programmatic linkage is even harder than before. So when in this context, politicians will just take advantage of low-hanging fruit. Clientelism, and especially incorporation, pay attention to this. Because there are not enough resources to distribute individualist benefits, material benefits to be distributed among party supporters, politicians and their operatives will want to take advantage of identities. will want to take advantage of religion in a context where parties are desperate for finding ways to connect, to have linkage with the population. Religion, a key dimension of human identity, will be that low-hanging fruit that they will want to take advantage of. The current democratic fragility and the low-hanging fruit represented by religious fervor and limited, probably also limited critical thinking skills make faith communities in many places of the Americas an attractive catch. So what they are trying to do is they are trying to connect with a specific interest that they know will connect with religious people. And this is the problem when our religious communities are only focused on single issues instead of broader causes that promote the common good. Then it's very easy for unscrupulous politicians to take advantage of that. So to connect with evangelical voters, political actors promise group-targeted policies that will offer benefits to churches and groups connected to them, will offer party nominations for representatives of the churches, and especially articulate identity-based appeals for a specific sector of the church. In this articulation is rather superficial, as I will explain in the next section. So you probably are familiar with a bell curve that describes the typical distribution of the people, right? So the hypothesis is that there is a normal distribution in that citizens who are Protestant or evangelical are like the rest of the population, typically in the middle. They are the persuadable middle. On the extremes are the people who have very profound convictions, whether to the right or to the left, but most people can be persuaded one way or the other. And being persuadable is not a bad thing, but there is a serious problem if citizens who are people of faith are willing to sacrifice their commitments to the common good in exchange for one or two single issues in the government. So one way in which politicians and their operatives seek to connect with people of faith is through persuasion. Persuasion means lobbying, speech-making, debating, writing letters, issuing position papers, making proclamations in the form of court decisions, executive orders, passing laws, promoting policies. They are all examples of persuasion. You could even say that this particular presentation is an example of persuasion. And yes, it is, because I am trying to persuade you of something. And as long as the person who is receiving the message knows that the person that is projecting the message, wants to persuade them, it is fine, because it is a competition in the marketplace of ideas. So as long as political operatives are trying to persuade people of faith, making their intentions clear, persuasion is legitimate, because that is how politics work. And we want to persuade citizens to vote one way or the other. That is fine. The problem is not persuasion, but manipulation. Manipulation happens when the political parties, the individual candidates, or other political agents, even religious agents, conceal their intentions. The difference is important, because while persuasion is legitimate, manipulation is very dangerous. When people are persuaded, they know, they are able to feel that they have been convinced by the arguments presented to them. And again, that's legitimate. By contrast, when people are manipulated, they do not know they are being manipulated. They do not know that they could resist something, that they could disagree, because they are ignoring the force that is taking place in that particular moment. Masters of manipulation for your consideration. So even though manipulation is very difficult to prove due to precisely its hidden nature, I insist that politicians and some religious leaders in Latin America tend to manipulate believers by using superficial connections to the people's faith in a few passages from the Holy Scripture. Political operatives do not come to the church or to a group in the community, and they do not alert evangelical audience saying, I have hired somebody who is from your church or from another church who has taught me that some key phrases evangelicals use, like being born again, or depending on the Holy Spirit, or praying constantly without ceasing about something. They are not telling us that they are using these phrases in this specific messaging that has been particularly tailored to catch the attention of evangelicals, so that they can persuade us to vote for them or their political party. So the listeners hear someone who talks like them, and they hear a discourse that sounds Christian, that talks about the Bible and Bible verses, probably out of context. And they recognize that message and think, oh, this is a Christian. This is a person that loves God and loves people. So we should vote for them, without considering the actual policies that those people are advancing. So the people in the churches ignore that the candidates and other political agents are exploiting their faith. The existence of cloaked motives and the language layers they use implies some degree of manipulation, in many cases severe. So this way of doing politics has very bad consequences. It exposes vulnerabilities for democracy, as well as terrible risks for the health of congregations as social and cultural institutions. So what should we do? The reason for the decline in the programmatic character of parties are varied, but the point of this paper has been that political parties in several countries are struggling to present clear and effective policy solutions to the problems of the people. This further diminishes the prospects of programmatic representation and creates incentives for politicians to take advantage of clientelism or incorporation. The competition for votes without relevant programmatic linkage with the population creates powerful incentives among politicians to use a particular rhetoric that exploits people's faith. In a context where political parties are struggling to find ways to secure linkage with the population, an effective integrist and fundamentalist agenda has been expanding in the region with great economic and political capital, sometimes with international support. And this represents the case of incorporation. So we need deeper critical thinking and better civic formation for Christians so that they can expose those who are trying to manipulate them. In a context of political crisis, the deepening of inequalities and the reduction of spaces for civil society participation, people of faith need to be ever alert to the manipulation that they could suffer at the hands of politicians and even religious leaders. People of faith need to make the effort to deepen in their civic formation as responsible citizens, avoid single-issue politics, and consider the coherence needed in political discourse and action as they consider what parties they should support in their own countries. The increase in the assassination of environmental activists, human rights defenders, and indigenous leaders, and the continued weakening of democratic systems need to be concerns that are in the imagination and the discourse and the dialogue within the churches. The church does not need to capture political power to bear witness of the gospel of Jesus of Nazareth. Christians need to be responsible citizens and recognize that they are accountable to God and to their country in how they use their vote and their voice as citizens. Muchas gracias.